I am Brianna Collins, and I was exactly 25 years and 4 hours old when my parents sent a text message to cancel my birthday. They chose to attend a fabricated medical crisis for my younger sister instead. I did not type back a defense. I did not shed a tear over my untouched wine glass. I just sat at my kitchen island and listened to the Seattle rain hit the glass. Next to my phone was a thick manila folder. It did not contain a birthday card. It contained a certified transfer of a $5 million holding company. What my parents did not know as they typed their practiced excuses from a luxury clinic waiting room was that their entire polished Bellevue lifestyle was secretly collateralized inside that exact folder. They thought they were simply discarding a daughter. They had no idea they were formally resigning from their own safety net. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where we tell true-to-life family stories about ordinary people who finally stop paying the price for someone else to be comfortable. If you have ever been treated like a line item in your own family, this one is for you. Drop a comment below and be sure to subscribe. I work as a forensic accountant at a firm downtown. I spend my days tracing hidden assets, unraveling corporate fraud, and finding the quiet truths buried beneath loud lies. I read bank statements the way other people read novels. When a business is failing, the numbers always tell the story before the owners do. Yet for 25 years, the one ledger I refused to audit was my own family. To understand the text message that ended everything, you have to understand the math of the Collins household. My mother, Linda, treated our family like a boutique public relations firm, where my younger sister, Vanessa, was the sole client. Vanessa was fragile. She was a professional victim who could turn a misplaced set of keys into a 3-day emotional crisis requiring emergency funding. I, on the other hand, was the capable one. In my family, being capable did not mean you were respected. It meant you were an inexhaustible utility. You were the generator running in the background to keep the lights on for the favorite child. Just 3 weeks prior, Vanessa backed her leased Audi into a retaining wall outside a day spa. Instead of holding her accountable, my father, David, smoothly suggested I cover the deductible. He sat at the dinner table and poured a glass of wine while explaining that I had a steady corporate salary and it was only right to help my sister. I refused. It was a rare boundary that caused the temperature in the house to drop 10 degrees. Vanessa retaliated by weeping that I was unsupportive of her mental health journey. The groundwork was laid right then. I knew my upcoming 25th birthday would be the battleground where they would punish me for closing my wallet. I just did not know the exact weapon they would use until my phone lit up on my kitchen counter that Friday night, proving that they were willing to cancel my existence just to keep her comfortable. The day after I refused to pay for the car repairs, the silence in my family began. It was not a passive quiet. It was a coordinated strike. My mother wielded silence the way a surgeon wields a blade, cutting away pieces of my daily life until I was isolated enough to surrender. Phone calls went straight to voicemail. Sunday dinner invitations vanished into thin air. When you grow up as the designated utility in a family, you learn very quickly that affection is a subscription service. If you stop paying the premium, they cut the feed. Linda spent her life curating a flawless Bellevue image. She hosted charity galas and arranged our family photos by color palette. She needed an audience to validate her existence, and Vanessa was her favorite co-star. I learned this when I was 16. I had just won a state math competition, but on the drive home, Vanessa complained that her throat felt scratchy. Linda turned the car around, skipped my award ceremony, and spent the entire weekend nursing a phantom cold. I realized then that my achievements were invisible because they required nothing from her. Vanessa and her endless weakness, however, required everything, and that made Linda feel indispensable. 2 weeks before my 25th birthday, my father, David, tried to break the stalemate. He did not invite me to lunch or send a text. He showed up at my firm unannounced. He sat in the visitor chair of my office looking at my framed degrees with a mixture of pride and resentment. David ran a consulting business that had been bleeding capital for a decade, though he hid it behind custom suits and leased luxury vehicles. He believed that paying for my college tuition meant he owned equity in my adulthood. He told me that Vanessa was having panic attacks because she felt I hated her. He said she could not sleep knowing there was a rift between us. I sat across from him looking at the subtle fraying on his shirt cuffs. I asked him if she was having panic attacks about my feelings or about the auto body shop invoice she could not afford to pay. He stiffened and looked away. He told me I was being cold. He said families look after their own and that my sister needed a safety net. I replied that a safety net is meant to catch someone who falls, not someone who jumps off a roof just to see who will catch her. That single sentence sealed my fate. David left my office with a tight jaw and a specific look of disappointment that used to crush me when I was younger. This time I just watched the elevator doors close and went back to analyzing a corporate bankruptcy file. But the fallout was swift. By that evening, the family group chat was scrubbed of my presence. My aunt sent me a lengthy message suggesting I needed to practice grace and forgiveness. Vanessa was actively campaigning painting herself as a fragile bird, terrorized by a heartless corporate sibling. The story was decided. I became the antagonist because I refused to surrender my paycheck. Being the capable one is a strange and heavy curse. People look at your steady job, your clean apartment, and your ability to solve your own problems, and they decide you no longer require empathy. You become an appliance. When a refrigerator runs quietly in the corner, nobody praises it. They just expect it to keep the food cold. But if it stops working, they kick it. For 25 years, I had kept the food cold. I paid my own way through state school. I secured a lucrative job. I never asked for loans or favors. I made myself so frictionless that my parents could pour every ounce of their energy and resources into Vanessa. I used to believe that if I just proved how self-sufficient I was, they would eventually respect me. I thought independence was the currency that would buy their love. I was wrong. Independence only bought my exclusion. Vanessa knew this instinctively. She knew that incompetence was a magnet for attention. She failed college courses so my father would have to hire tutors and spend hours sitting with her at the kitchen table. She dated terrible men so my mother could swoop in and play the heroic rescuer. They were locked in a codependent waltz, and I was standing on the sidelines holding the coats. The 25th birthday is a significant milestone. It is the age where you are undeniably an adult, where the excuses of youth expire. I knew my parents could not simply ignore it without damaging their own carefully crafted public image. They needed to acknowledge it to maintain the illusion of a perfect family. But they also needed to punish me for the boundary I had drawn in my office. They needed to teach me a lesson about what happens when the utility stops generating power. I received a taste of their strategy a week before the actual date. Vanessa posted a picture on social media. It was a throwback photo of the three of them on a vacation in Cabo, a trip I had skipped because I was studying for my certified public accountant exams. The caption read that true family sticks together through the hard times. It was a public declaration of loyalty that specifically excluded me. It was a digital warning shot. She was testing the waters, gathering sympathy, and preparing the audience for the main event. As a forensic accountant, I am trained to look for patterns. Fraud is rarely a single isolated event. It is a series of small calculated decisions designed to extract value while hiding the theft. Emotional fraud operates the exact same way. My family had been skimming my self-worth for decades, depositing it into Vanessa and her endless drama. I sat in my apartment watching the rain streak down the windows and mapped out their behavioral ledger. I anticipated the diversion. I knew they would manufacture a crisis to avoid celebrating me. They could not afford to put me at the center of the table because it would mean acknowledging that I had built my own life without their funding. I could have let the day pass quietly. I could have treated it like any other Saturday, ordered takeout and watched a movie. But a part of me wanted to force the issue. I wanted to see if they would actually cross the final line. I wanted to gather the evidence I needed to close the account forever. You cannot convict someone of a crime until they actually commit it. I needed them to make their choice out in the open where they could never deny it later. I decided to build a simple structure, a time, a place, and an invitation. I would set the table and wait to see who decided to sit down. Playing their game meant lowering my standards to meet theirs. Instead, I decided to elevate the stakes. If they were going to cancel on me, I would make sure the cancellation was undeniable. I would remove every obstacle, every excuse, and every logistical hurdle. I would make it so easy to show up that their absence would be a deliberate, loud declaration of their priorities. I reached for my laptop and opened the browser. The battle lines were drawn in the quiet space of my living room, and I was ready to make my opening move. I executed my plan on a Tuesday morning before my first client meeting. I did not choose a casual diner or a loud, crowded bar. I selected an upscale restaurant that sat right on the edge of Puget Sound. The dining room featured floor-to-ceiling glass, offering an unobstructed view of the water and the ferries crossing the dark currents. It was a place where corporate mergers were finalized and discreet negotiations took place. It was not a place where you could easily hide bad behavior or throw a tantrum without drawing the eyes of the entire room. I requested a private corner table for 5 people. The hostess informed me that a reservation of that size required a non-refundable deposit to secure the space. I gave her my credit card number without a moment of hesitation. Paying that fee was a strategic decision. I wanted to eliminate any logistical or financial excuses my family might try to leverage. I did not ask my parents to host the evening. I did not ask them to plan a single detail, coordinate a schedule, or pay for a single appetizer. I absorbed the entire cost of the evening up front. I merely required them to put on appropriate clothing and arrive at 7 o'clock on a Saturday. With the table secured, I drafted a message to the family group chat. I kept the text brief and factual. I stated the location, the time, and the name the reservation was booked under. I did not add pleading emojis or emotional appeals to try and coax them into attending. I hit send and set my phone face down on my desk. In forensic accounting, you learn a great deal by observing response times. A fast reply usually indicates confidence or a pre-planned narrative. A slow reply indicates coordination and a scrambling for a solid alibi. It took my father exactly 4 hours to respond. His reply consisted of a single thumbs-up emoji. It was the digital equivalent of a polite nod from across a room, requiring zero actual commitment and offering zero warmth. My mother did not reply that day at all. She let the message sit in the chat, gathering digital dust until Thursday afternoon. When her response finally arrived, it was a masterclass in non-committal phrasing. She wrote that the restaurant sounded lovely, but they would have to see how Vanessa recovered from her new physical therapy sessions before making any firm promises. Vanessa had recently claimed her posture was causing stress migraines, requiring expensive weekly alignments at a boutique clinic. Linda was already building the exit ramp. There was only one person in that group chat who treated the invitation like a binding contract. 10 minutes after my mother sent her vague excuse, my phone rang. The caller ID displayed a Mercer Island landline. It was my grandmother, Evelyn. She was my father's mother, and she was a woman carved from dense Washington timber. Evelyn lived alone on a sprawling waterfront estate she had purchased with her late husband decades ago. She wore sharp, tailored coats and possessed a mind that could dissect a lie from 50 paces away. While my parents operated on manipulation and fragile optics, Evelyn operated strictly on merit and reality. She was the only adult in my bloodline who looked at me and saw a human being instead of a designated problem solver. She did not say hello when I answered the phone. She simply stated that she would be driving herself to the restaurant and asked if I preferred red or white wine. I told her red was fine. She paused, allowing the silence to hang on the line before asking what excuse my mother was currently laying the groundwork to use. I read the text about the physical therapy aloud. Evelyn let out a short, dry laugh that sounded like dead leaves scraping across a stone driveway. She noted that Vanessa had the constitution of a boiled potato and told me to wear something expensive on Saturday. My relationship with Evelyn was built on a foundation of quiet, mutual understanding. She never intervened in my parents' daily theatrics, but she always made sure I knew she saw right through them. I understood her value system clearly when I was 10 years old. It was the week of the fifth grade science fair. I had spent a month building a functional scale model of a hydroelectric dam using recycled materials and a small water pump. I mapped out the schematics myself on graph paper. The night before the presentation, Vanessa threw a screaming tantrum because my mother would not buy her a specific brand of shoes for a middle school dance. During her meltdown, Vanessa knocked my project off the kitchen counter, shattering the plastic casing and snapping the motor in half. My mother swept up the broken pieces and told me not to be upset because it was just a silly school project and my sister was going through a hard time. She prioritized the tantrum over my ruined work. I sat on the back porch, staring at the broken motor in my lap. Evelyn had been visiting for the weekend. She walked out onto the porch holding a glass of iced tea. She did not offer me hollow comfort. She did not tell me that sisters fight and I should be the bigger person. Instead, she reached into her purse, pulled out a crisp $50 bill, and folded it into my palm. She looked me straight in the eye and whispered a sentence that became the architectural blueprint of my entire adult life. She told me to never let people who build nothing tear down what I have made. I clung to that sentence for 15 years. I used that $50 to buy better materials and rebuild a smaller working version of the dam before sunrise. I won first place. Evelyn attended the ceremony while my parents stayed home to soothe Vanessa. That dynamic never shifted. Evelyn watched me build my career, my savings, and my quiet life with an approving eye. She knew the exact currency my parents dealt in, and she refused to accept it or validate it. Hanging up the phone with her, I felt a profound sense of clarity. The board was set. My father had offered a hollow digital gesture. My mother had planted the seed of a medical excuse. My grandmother had confirmed her attendance and dressed for a reckoning. The contrast was stark and illuminating. I spent the rest of the week reviewing financial portfolios for my clients, while keeping a subtle watch on the family chat. The digital theater played out exactly as I predicted. I watched the physical therapy excuse slowly mutate and expand day by day. Vanessa started complaining about referred nerve pain shooting down her arm. Linda began sending links to holistic wellness retreats and tagging my father. David responded with praying hands emojis. The performance was exhausting in its predictability. They thought they were being incredibly clever. They thought they were carefully laying down a believable trail of evidence that would eventually justify their absence from my birthday dinner. They had no idea I was treating their messages like a fraudulent ledger, picking up every discrepancy and cataloging it. I did not challenge the escalating complaints. I did not suggest alternative treatments or ask for clarification on the sudden nerve pain. I remained perfectly silent, offering them an endless supply of rope. The trap was holding steady on the restaurant reservation system. All I had to do was wait for the manufactured crisis to reach its inevitable climax. The tension in the air was palpable even through a screen. I knew the final maneuver, the one designed to force me to cancel my own celebration, would arrive soon. I just needed to see the precise staging they would use to pull the trigger. The phone vibrated against the mahogany grain of my desk. It was Thursday afternoon, exactly 48 hours before the reservation at the waterfront restaurant. The screen illuminated, revealing a new notification from the family group chat. I picked up the device and opened the application. Vanessa had uploaded a photograph. It was a carefully composed selfie taken from a low angle to emphasize a look of tragic vulnerability. She was wearing a pale blue medical gown. Her hair was artfully tousled, resting over one shoulder. The lighting in the room was soft and flattering. Real emergency rooms possess a harsh fluorescent glare that washes out the skin and casts sharp shadows. Real emergency rooms are chaotic spaces filled with monitor alarms and hurried footsteps. The room in Vanessa's photograph featured warm, ambient lighting and a piece of abstract art hanging on the wall behind her head. The caption beneath the image read, "Palpitations again. ER says it is severe stress-induced arrhythmia. They want to hold me for observation." The performance was immaculate. She deployed the medical terminology with just enough vagueness to avoid specific questions, but enough severity to demand immediate action. Arrhythmia sounds terrifying to an untrained ear. To Vanessa, it was a golden ticket out of accountability and a direct funnel for parental attention. My mother responded in under 60 seconds. The screen filled with a rapid succession of panicked text messages. She wrote that she was grabbing her keys and running to the car. She told Vanessa to hold on and promised that they were coming. She added that David was already leaving his office and told Vanessa not to be scared. I sat back in my leather chair. I did not type a word of comfort. I did not ask for the address of the hospital. I operated on instinct cultivated by years of investigating corporate embezzlement. When an executive presents a sudden unexpected loss, you do not offer sympathy. You verify the receipts. I saved the photograph to my hard drive and opened a piece of diagnostic software I routinely use to verify the authenticity of financial documents and digital evidence. A photograph taken on a modern smartphone carries a payload of invisible information known as exchangeable image file format data. It records the exact camera settings, the time the image was captured, and most importantly, the precise global positioning coordinates of the device at the moment the shutter clicked. I extracted the latitude and longitude from Vanessa's tragic selfie. I copied the numerical values and pasted them into a satellite mapping program. The map zoomed out of my downtown office and tracked eastward across the lake, settling on a commercial sector in a wealthy suburb. I switched to the Street View mode. The red location pin did not land on the sprawling campus of a regional trauma center. It landed on a boutique urgent care clinic situated in an upscale outdoor retail pavilion. I recognized the address immediately. It was situated exactly 3 doors down from a luxury wellness spa where Vanessa regularly booked deep tissue massages and botanical facials. The narrative unraveled right there on my dual monitors. Vanessa had not collapsed from a sudden heart condition. She had finished her spa treatment, walked a few hundred feet down the sidewalk, and checked herself into a high-end clinic that caters to wealthy clients experiencing mild discomfort. A real emergency room triages patients based on the immediate threat to their life. A boutique clinic triages patients based on the tier of their health insurance and their willingness to pay an exorbitant out-of-pocket premium for a private suite. They sell the illusion of intensive care. It was not a medical emergency. It was an extraction. Vanessa had felt the spotlight drifting away from her. The upcoming Saturday dinner represented a threat to her monopoly on our parents' focus. She needed to yank the spotlight back using the only currency she possessed, which was manufactured trauma. By declaring a medical crisis 48 hours before my birthday, she forced our parents to choose between a healthy, capable daughter and a sick, fragile one. It was a rigged election, and she already knew the outcome. I watched the group chat continue to scroll. My father chimed in, stating he was canceling his afternoon strategy meetings to drive across the bridge. Linda asked if Vanessa needed her specialized silk blanket from the house. They were eagerly slipping into their established roles as the protective martyrs rushing to shield their broken child from the cruel world. Not a single message referenced my birthday. Not one sentence acknowledged the reservation I had booked, or the fact that this sudden emergency conveniently eclipsed the one night of the year dedicated to my existence. The machinery of my childhood was operating with flawless precision. This tactic was not new. It was a well-worn strategy Vanessa deployed whenever she faced the prospect of sharing the stage. I experienced the exact same maneuver on the morning of my college move-in day. My parents had promised to drive a rented moving truck to the university and help me carry my belongings into the dormitory. I had packed the boxes myself and mapped the route. 2 hours before we were scheduled to depart, Vanessa claimed she had eaten a bad scallop at a seafood restaurant the night prior. She performed a theatrical display of agony on the living room floor, gripping her stomach and sobbing. My parents immediately abandoned the moving plan. Linda ordered me to take my own car and leave the large furniture behind because Vanessa required a quiet house and constant monitoring. I drove to the university alone. I navigated the chaotic campus traffic, signed my own housing documents, and carried 16 heavy boxes up 3 flights of stairs by myself. My parents never arrived. When I returned home for the Thanksgiving holiday, The heavy furniture was still sitting in the garage, right where I left it. Vanessa learned that day that illness was a trump card. It negated all previous commitments and rendered my needs invisible. She honed the skill over the years, refining her symptoms to be increasingly complex and difficult to disprove. A stomach ache evolved into chronic fatigue. A headache morphed into neurological tension. And now, a simple desire for attention had escalated into stress-induced arrhythmia, requiring an overnight hold at a boutique clinic. I sat in the quiet hum of my office, watching the blue text bubbles pile up on my phone screen. I felt a cold clinical detachment settle over my skin. The old Brianna would have felt a familiar knot of anxiety form in her chest. The old Brianna would have typed a carefully worded message asking for the specific medical diagnosis, trying to poke holes in the lie. She would have engaged in the futile battle for the truth. I did not engage. I let the phone sit silent on the desk. The forensic accountant inside me understood that confronting a fraudster with early evidence only teaches them to build a better lie. If I revealed the location data, Vanessa would claim she was too disoriented to find a real hospital and stumbled into the nearest clinic. Linda would accuse me of being an invasive, paranoid sister who cared more about proving a point than showing compassion. They would spin the evidence to reinforce their own victimhood. The strongest position in any negotiation is the one that requires no defense. I decided to let them have their illusion. I wanted them to build the structure of their betrayal with their own hands, brick by brick, until it was too heavy to dismantle. I wanted them to feel secure in their deception. I closed the diagnostic software and minimized the mapping program. I returned my attention to the commercial shipping file open on my primary monitor. The numbers on the spreadsheet were rational. They followed a predictable logic of cause and effect. I found comfort in their rigid honesty. The digital panic in the family chat eventually subsided as Linda and David arrived at the clinic to begin their bedside vigil. The stage was set, and the actors were in position. I knew what the next act required. The crisis had been established, but the formal execution of my birthday dinner was still pending. They had laid the groundwork for their absence, but they still needed to deliver the actual cancellation. I turned my phone face down on the mahogany wood and waited for Friday morning to arrive, knowing exactly how the conversation would sound. The official call arrived on Friday morning at precisely 9 o'clock. I was sitting at my desk at the firm holding a cup of black coffee and watching the gray Seattle rain streak across the floor to ceiling windows. My cell phone vibrated against the polished wood. The screen illuminated to display my mother's name. I let it vibrate 3 times. I took a slow sip of my coffee, mapping out the conversation in my head before I ever swiped the screen to answer. I knew the script she was going to use. I knew the exact cadence she would employ. I pressed the green button and lifted the phone to my ear. I did not offer a cheerful greeting. I simply stated her name. Linda bypassed small talk and went straight into her curated performance. Her voice was clipped and coated in a brittle, practiced warmth. It was the specific tone she used to deliver bad news that she felt zero guilt about. It was the voice of a corporate human resources manager explaining a layoff. She started by calling me honey. She only used terms of endearment when she was about to ask for a concession. She told me that they were not going to be able to make it to the restaurant tomorrow night. She sighed a heavy, theatrical sigh into the receiver. She explained that Vanessa was in a very dark place. She said the medical episode at the clinic had taken a severe toll on her emotional stability. My mother lowered her voice to a reverent whisper and said they needed to surround my sister with light right now. She finished the monologue with a phrase designed to trap me into compliance. She said she knew I would understand. I stared out my office window at the sharp edges of the downtown skyline. I held the phone to my ear with my left hand. My right hand moved the computer mouse. I clicked open a web browser and navigated to a social media platform. I clicked on the glowing circle around Vanessa's profile picture. The video began to play. Vanessa was not in a very dark place. She was in a brightly lit room filled with ergonomic leather massage chairs and tropical potted plants. A technician in a neat uniform was painting her fingernails a pale shade of pink. Vanessa held a glass of sparkling water with a slice of lime resting on the rim. She tapped her wet acrylic nails against the crystal glass, creating a sharp rhythmic clicking sound over the ambient spa music. The location tag overlaid on the video clearly identified a luxury nail salon situated exactly 2 blocks away from the boutique medical clinic she had occupied the night before. I looked at the pastel polish on my monitor and listened to my mother breathe through the phone speaker. The old version of me would have taken a digital screenshot of the video. The old version of me would have sent the image to my mother and demanded an explanation for the blatant contradiction. The old version of me craved justice and believed that presenting undeniable evidence would finally force my parents to admit their bias. But the forensic accountant sitting in the leather chair recognized the situation for what it truly was. It was a sunk cost. In economics, a sunk cost refers to capital that has already been spent and cannot be recovered under any circumstances. A poor investor will continue to pour new money into a failing venture because they are emotionally attached to their initial loss. They refuse to accept the reality of the deficit. A smart investor cuts the funding, absorbs the loss, and walks away to find a profitable asset. Arguing with my mother would only feed the drama. It would require me to spend more emotional capital on a relationship that consistently yielded a negative return. If I confronted her with the nail salon video, she would pivot. She would claim that a manicure was part of a holistic healing process. She would accuse me of stalking my sister online instead of showing empathy. The lie was not a mistake. The lie was the entire foundation of their ecosystem. I looked at the Seattle skyline and chose to be a smart investor. Okay, I said. It was a single flat word. It carried no anger, it carried no sorrow, it offered no friction. The phone line went silent. I could hear my mother taking a short, uneven breath. She was waiting for the argument. My mother required friction to navigate her relationships. She needed me to act unreasonable so she could feel justified in her neglect. She expected me to raise my voice or hang up in tears. My lack of resistance confused her programming. When you push against a solid wall, you expect it to hold your weight. When the wall suddenly vanishes, you stumble forward and lose your balance. "Are you sure you are all right, Brianna?" she asked. Her voice lacked the practiced warmth now. It sounded hesitant and slightly paranoid. "I am fine, Mom," I replied. My tone remained perfectly level. She paused again, clearly disappointed by my refusal to play the role of the wounded daughter. She needed to exit the conversation while maintaining her self-image as a caring parent. She reached for the familiar placation. She said we would celebrate my birthday another time. She added the promise hastily, like a nervous shopper sliding a credit card across a counter hoping the cashier will not notice it is expired. It was a verbal check that never clears. I possessed a mental filing cabinet full of those uncashed checks. When I received my letter of acceptance to a top-tier accounting program, my parents promised to take me out for a celebratory steak dinner. That dinner was quietly converted into a catering tasting for a holiday party Vanessa was hosting. When I passed my professional licensing exams, they promised a weekend trip to a coastal resort. That trip evaporated when Vanessa decided she needed a mental health week in the mountains and required their funding. The promise of another time was just a polite, socially acceptable way of saying never. "Of course," I replied. I did not wait for her to say goodbye. I pulled the phone away from my ear and tapped the red button to end the call. I did not log on to the restaurant website to cancel the reservation. I picked up my desk phone and dialed the concierge desk at the waterfront dining room. I spoke to the hostess and provided my confirmation number. I told her I needed to adjust the head count. I changed the reservation from a party of 5 down to a party of 2. It would just be me and my grandmother Evelyn. The hostess confirmed the corner table was still mine and wished me a wonderful evening. I set the receiver down in its cradle. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. I waited for the physiological reaction. I expected to feel the familiar sting of rejection behind my eyes. I expected the heavy, dull ache in my chest that had accompanied every abandoned milestone of my childhood. I braced my body for the wave of grief that usually followed my parents choosing my sister over me. The wave never arrived. Instead, I felt an incredible sense of empty space. The tight knot of anxiety that had lived under my ribs for 2 decades simply unspooled and dissolved into nothing. I took a deep breath and the air felt different in my lungs. It felt thin and clean. I had spent a quarter-century auditing my worth in their eyes. I had generated perfect grades, secured a flawless career, and demanded nothing from their bank accounts. I had presented them with a perfect ledger, hoping to eventually find a positive balance in their affection. The final balance was zero. The math was finally settled. The silence that filled my office was not a tragedy. It was the liberating clarity of an account finally closed. You cannot be disappointed by an empty room once you stop expecting people to walk through the door. My parents had made their final transaction. They had successfully purchased their illusion, but they had used my presence as the currency. I was no longer willing to fund the purchase. I opened my eyes and looked at the commercial shipping file open on my primary monitor. The numbers on the screen made sense. They were rational and honest. I spent the remainder of the Friday workday operating with a sharp, focused energy. My mind was clear. When 5 o'clock arrived, I packed my leather tote bag and rode the elevator down to the lobby. The rain had stopped, leaving the Seattle streets slick and reflective under the streetlights. Tomorrow was Saturday. Tomorrow I would turn 25 years old. I would sit at a corner table overlooking the dark water of Puget Sound. I would not be waiting for people who were never going to arrive. I would be waiting for the only woman in my family who understood the true cost of building a life. And as I drove back to my apartment, I knew Evelyn was bringing something far more consequential than a birthday gift to that table. She was bringing a reckoning. Saturday night arrived with a bitter chill off the water. I walked into the restaurant at 6:45. The dining room was a symphony of hushed wealth. Waiters moved silently across the thick carpet carrying silver trays. The air smelled of roasted garlic and expensive perfume. I gave the hostess my name, and she guided me to the private corner table I had secured days earlier. The table sat right against the floor-to-ceiling glass. Outside the window, the dark expanse of Puget Sound stretched toward the horizon. I watched a green and white ferry cut through the heavy currents ferrying commuters back to the islands. I took my seat facing the entrance. The waiter removed the 3 extra place settings without asking a single question. I appreciated his discretion. I ordered a glass of mineral water and waited. I did not check my phone. I knew there were no incoming messages from my parents. The silence from their end of the city was a confirmed fact. At exactly 7 o'clock, the heavy oak doors at the front of the restaurant swung open. My grandmother Evelyn walked through them. She did not scan the room with the frantic energy of someone looking for a lost party. She possessed a gravitational pull that commanded the space around her. She wore her signature camel coat over a tailored charcoal suit. Her silver hair was styled with immaculate precision. Evelyn and my late grandfather Thomas had built their fortune long before the Seattle tech boom altered the skyline. They did not invent software. They purchased unremarkable commercial lots and held them for decades, reading municipal zoning laws and waiting for the city to grow toward their investments. They understood patience. They understood that real power does not need to announce itself. My father David inherited their preference for expensive things, but he inherited none of their discipline. He preferred the appearance of success over the grueling mechanics of actual wealth generation. Evelyn approached the table. The maitre d' pulled back the chair across from me. She sat down and smoothed the napkin over her lap. She looked at the 2 empty spaces where my parents were supposed to be sitting. She did not offer me a look of pity. Pity is a useless emotion reserved for victims, and Evelyn respected me too much to treat me like one. She simply caught the attention of our waiter. She ordered a martini extremely dry with a twist of lemon. She waited until the waiter stepped away before she addressed the obvious void at the table. They chose the theater over the reality, she stated, taking a slow sip of her ice water. Just as I suspected. She did not ask for details about Vanessa and her sudden medical crisis. She already knew the shape of the lie. Evelyn possessed a predatory instinct for detecting fraud. It was the same instinct that made her a formidable force in commercial real estate. She unbuttoned her camel coat and reached down to the floor. She lifted a sleek leather-bound briefcase and placed it directly onto the white tablecloth right next to the woven breadbasket. The briefcase was not a modern nylon laptop bag. It was an older piece of structured cordovan leather featuring heavy brass hardware and a reinforced handle. It looked out of place in the delicate, fine dining environment. It looked like an object that belonged in a high-stakes boardroom or a bank vault. I looked at the case, and then I looked at her face. Her expression had shifted from polite dinner companion to strict corporate executive. "I have been waiting for you to turn 25, Brianna," she said, her voice dropping to a low, serious register. It was the tone she used when she was explaining terms of a contract. She folded her hands together on the table. The waiter returned and placed her martini in front of her. She did not touch the stem of the glass. She kept her eyes locked on mine. "Your father operates under a very dangerous set of assumptions," she continued. "He believes that because he is my only living son, my entire estate is wrapped up in standard revocable trusts. He thinks that when I pass away, the capital will simply default to him through the normal channels of inheritance. He has built his entire financial life on that singular assumption. He thinks his country club lifestyle and his failing consulting firm are insulated by my eventual death. He treats my net worth as his personal delayed savings account." I listened to her words. As a forensic accountant, I understood exactly what she was describing. It is a common phenomenon among the children of the self-made wealthy. They mistake proximity to capital for the ability to generate it. My father leased luxury vehicles and financed a $4 million home in Bellevue because he believed the safety net was guaranteed. He spent money he had not yet earned because he was banking on a dead woman's ledger. "He is wrong," Evelyn said. The words hung in the air, sharp and final. "And tonight I am going to show you exactly how wrong he is." She reached into the pocket of her tailored suit jacket. She withdrew a heavy brass key. It was an old-fashioned barrel key designed for the lock on the leather briefcase. She placed her index finger on top of the metal and slid the key across the smooth linen tablecloth. The brass caught the dim restaurant lighting as it moved, stopping precisely in front of my water glass. I looked down at the key. The metal felt cold, radiating a silent authority. I did not ask her if she was sure. I did not feign ignorance or perform a display of false humility. I am a professional auditor. I spend my waking hours hunting for the leverage that people try to bury in shell companies and offshore accounts. I know what leverage looks like. I know what it smells like. The scent of buried leverage was rising right off the cordovan leather sitting between our dinner plates. My hands did not shake as I reached out and picked up the key. The metal was heavy in my palm. The weight of it felt like a promise. For 25 years, my parents had treated me like an infinite resource they could draw from without consequence. They had canceled my birthday to cater to a manufactured emergency because they believed I held no power to stop them. They believed their positions were secure. They had no idea that the woman sitting across from me had spent years preparing a countermeasure. Evelyn watched me hold the key. A faint smile touched the corners of her mouth. It was not a warm maternal smile. It was the smile of a chess player who had just watched her opponent walk blindly into a checkmate sequence. She had waited for me to reach an age of undisputed legal and intellectual maturity. She needed me to be fully established in my career. She needed me to understand the complex architecture of corporate finance so that when she handed me the weapon, I would know exactly how to fire it. "Open it," she instructed. Her voice was steady. "Let us review the ledger your father never knew existed." I inserted the brass key into the lock on the briefcase. The mechanism turned with a satisfying click. The sound was incredibly loud in the quiet dining room. I pushed the brass clasps outward. The leather lid popped open, revealing a stack of legal documents printed on heavy archival paper. The top document featured a bold corporate header and a bright blue notary seal. I did not see a birthday card or a sentimental letter. I saw the architectural blueprints of my parents' total financial ruin. I slid the top folder out of the case and prepared to read the numbers that would change the balance of power in my family forever. I pulled the single manila folder from the dark interior of the briefcase. The paper felt heavy and crisp, carrying the faint, distinct scent of fresh ink and cedar wood. The cover page displayed a bold legal header identifying the entity as Evergreen Holdings Limited Liability Company. I bypassed the standard introductory clauses and went straight for the asset declarations. As a forensic accountant, I know that the truth of any organization lives in the appendices. People lie in their mission statements and they lie in their public relations releases, but they cannot lie on a balance sheet. The numbers always reveal the true nature of the architect. I reviewed the documents with the speed and precision of a professional auditor. The initial pages outlined a substantial but standard portfolio of wealth. There were $5 million in liquid capital sitting in diversified index funds and municipal bonds. There were deeds to prime commercial real estate parcels scattered across the greater Washington area. It was a formidable accumulation of capital. But Evelyn had not called me to a corner table on my birthday just to hand me a standard trust fund. She had built a mechanism of absolute accountability. I turned the page to a document labeled Schedule A. This section detailed the specific private equity acquisitions the holding company had executed over the past 5 years. My eyes tracked down the columns of numerical data, interest rates, and legal property descriptions. The first item listed was a residential mortgage note. I recognized the parcel number. I recognized the street address printed in the left margin. It was the $4 million estate in Bellevue where my parents currently lived. My mother, Linda, treated that house like a royal palace. It featured vaulted ceilings, an infinity pool overlooking the city, and a custom chef kitchen she never actually used for cooking. It was the primary stage for her curated public image. She hosted lavish charity functions there solely to prove her social standing to the neighborhood. I read the terms of the mortgage outlined in the schedule, and the illusion dissolved. My parents did not own that property. They were highly leveraged. They had refinanced the house 5 years ago, extracting the equity to fund their expensive habits and support Vanessa and her endless demands. The second item on Schedule A was a commercial promissory note. The debtor was listed as Collins Strategic Consulting. That was my father David and his struggling business. David rented a high-rise office space downtown and employed a receptionist to maintain the illusion of a thriving enterprise. In reality, his client list had been shrinking for a decade. He survived by taking out a massive interest-only business loan. An interest-only loan is a highly dangerous financial instrument. You pay the minimum amount every month just to keep the bank away, while the original principal debt remains entirely intact. It is a slow financial death disguised as temporary relief. I looked across the table at my grandmother. She was watching me read the numbers. Her expression remained perfectly calm, reflecting the dark water outside the window. She set her martini glass down on the white cloth. She explained that she had monitored my father making reckless financial decisions for years. She watched him sink deeper into debt to support a lifestyle he could not actually afford. Instead of lecturing him or cutting him a check, she decided to take quiet control of his liabilities. Evelyn told me that she bought their debt quietly through a series of corporate proxies. When my parents refinanced their home and took out the commercial loan, they worked through a brokerage that sold the paper to a secondary market. Evelyn set up Evergreen Holdings as a ghost entity to purchase those specific notes. She used corporate lawyers and blind trusts to mask her identity from the public record. My parents believed they owed a faceless financial institution registered in Delaware. They paid their monthly premiums to a generic post office box, completely unaware of who was cashing the checks. "They think they owe a bank," Evelyn stated, her voice steady and precise over the ambient noise of the dining room. "They owe me." The gravity of her maneuver settled over the table. She had weaponized her wealth. She had not simply hidden her money from her greedy son to protect it. She had actively purchased the ground he walked on. Every time my mother threw a catered party to impress her neighbors, she was doing it inside a house owned by her mother-in-law. Every time my father put on a tailored suit and went to his empty office, he was operating under a loan controlled by his mother. They were exposed, and they had zero awareness of their vulnerability. They thought they were kings of their own castle, but they were just tenants living on borrowed time. I turned to the final page of the folder. This document was the distribution schedule. It dictated the rules of succession for the holding company. I expected to see a list of complex conditions, a delayed transfer timeline, or a board of trustees appointed to oversee my decisions. Instead, I found a single concise paragraph written in clear, definitive legal language. The clause stated that upon the 25th birthday of Brianna Collins, full controlling interest of Evergreen Holdings transfers exclusively to her. I read the sentence a second time to ensure I was not misinterpreting the legal phrasing. There were no CO signers required. There were no probationary periods. The transfer was immediate and absolute. The moment the clock struck midnight and marked my 25th year, the entire entity changed hands. The signature at the bottom of the page belonged to Evelyn, notarized and legally binding. I looked up from the paper. The air left my lungs in a slow, quiet exhale. Evelyn had not just given me a briefcase full of money. She had handed me the deed to my parents' entire reality. For 25 years, my mother and father had dictated the terms of my existence. They decided when I was useful and when I was invisible. They assigned me the role of the capable workhorse designed to carry the weight of their favorite child. They canceled my birthday because they believed I held no leverage to stop them. They believed they could discard me to focus on Vanessa and her fake medical crisis and face zero consequences because I possessed no power over their comfort. I looked down at the brass key resting on the table next to my water glass. That dynamic was officially dead. I was now the sole proprietor of the company that held their residential mortgage. I was the chief executive who controlled the commercial loan, keeping my father out of bankruptcy court. If they missed a single payment, I possessed the legal authority to initiate foreclosure proceedings. If I called in the business loan, my father would lose his firm in 30 days. The power dynamic had inverted completely while they were sitting in a luxury clinic catering to my sister. Evelyn leaned forward, resting her forearms on the table. She told me that she had structured the trust this way to give me a choice. She said power is only useful if you know how to wield it. She had watched me endure decades of emotional theft. She watched my parents harvest my stability to fund my sister and her endless manufactured crises. Evelyn built this financial instrument so I would never have to ask for their respect or their attention ever again. I could simply enforce the boundaries they had ignored for my entire life. The waiter approached the table carrying 2 menus bound in dark leather. He paused, noticing the legal documents spread across the linen. He politely asked if we were ready to order our entrees. Evelyn looked at me, waiting for my response. I placed the distribution schedule back into the manila folder. I closed the leather lid of the briefcase and secured the brass clasps, locking the leverage safely inside. I am ready, I told the waiter. I ordered a rare steak and another glass of mineral water. I felt a new rhythm in my pulse. The victim narrative was completely gone. The capable daughter who sat quietly in the background waiting for crumbs of affection had vanished into the Seattle night. I was a corporate auditor holding the ultimate ledger. The trap was armed and the safety was off. The next step was simply waiting for my parents to make a move. I knew they would reach out eventually. They always did when Vanessa needed something expensive. They would summon me to their Bellevue house and demand my compliance. They would try to assert their old authority over me. And when they did, I would be walking into their home not as an obedient daughter, but as their landlord. I sat in the glow of the table lamp looking at the thick cordovan leather resting between us. The lock was secured, but the reality of what was inside altered the air pressure in the room. I looked across the table at Evelyn. I asked her why she went to these incredible lengths. I kept my voice low so the sound would not carry to the adjacent tables. I asked her why she built a financial instrument this complex, just to prove a point my parents had already proven 1,000 times before. Evelyn did not answer immediately. She signaled the waiter to bring our plates. She waited until the porcelain dishes were set down and the staff retreated into the shadows of the dining room. Then she looked at me with an expression that possessed the dense gravity of a stone wall. She said she did it because she had watched them strip mine my capability to fund Vanessa and her incompetence for 2 full decades. Evelyn explained her vantage point. When you are the matriarch holding the primary wealth, you see exactly how the generations below you behave when they think you are not looking. She recounted a specific Tuesday evening 5 years ago. I was in my final semester of university. My transmission blew out on the highway. I needed $2,000 to fix it so I could commute to my accounting internship. I called my father asking for a brief loan. He told me funds were tied up and suggested I take the public bus. Evelyn discovered later that same evening my parents had purchased Vanessa a purebred French bulldog puppy for $4,000 because she claimed she felt lonely in her luxury apartment. I watched your mother price your worth at zero while leveraging your stability, Evelyn stated. She cut into her steak with precise, methodical movements. She told me Linda needed me to be reliable so she could afford to let Vanessa be a disaster. It is a predatory ecosystem. Evelyn knew that if she simply rewrote her will and left me the money, David would have contested it in probate court. He would have dragged me through years of litigation claiming she was not of sound mind. She needed an ironclad structure. She needed a holding company that bypassed probate entirely. And she needed to set a silent trap to finalize the terms. I stopped cutting my food. I asked her what she meant by a trap. Evelyn set her knife down on the edge of her plate. She explained that the distribution schedule inside the briefcase originally contained a conditional clause. It was designed to trigger based on the events of this exact evening. She knew I had booked the table. She knew I had paid the deposit and invited the family to celebrate my 25th birthday. If they had shown up for you tonight, Evelyn said, her eyes locking onto mine, if they had chosen you over a fabricated crisis just once, the trust would have been split equally. Half of the holding company would have transferred to David, ensuring his retirement and his home. The other half would have transferred to you. All they had to do was sit in those empty chairs and eat a meal. The arithmetic of the situation settled over me. My parents had literally cost themselves half of a $5 million empire and the deeds to their own lives because they could not resist the urge to cater to Vanessa. The boutique urgent care clinic, the fake stress-induced arrhythmia, the hasty cancellation phone call. Every single action they took over the last 48 hours was a nail in their own financial coffin. They built the gallows. They tied the knot. Evelyn simply let them drop the floor out from under themselves. But your mother could not resist a cancellation, Evelyn continued. She picked up her water glass. They made their choice. They decided you were not worth their time. So I decided they are no longer worth my money. I activated the contingency clause this afternoon when you confirmed they were not coming. The transfer executed at 5 o'clock. You own the entity in its entirety. I sat back against the leather upholstery of the dining chair. It was the most brutal and flawless boundary I had ever seen executed in my life. There was no screaming. There was no emotional manipulation. There were no tearful confrontations in a hospital waiting room. It was just process. It was the cold, hard arithmetic of cause and effect. My parents placed their bet on the fragile daughter and the house collected the chips. I looked at the briefcase. I did not feel vindictive. I did not feel the fiery rush of revenge that people always talk about in movies. I felt something much quieter and much more powerful. I felt the profound grounding weight of a woman who had finally been handed the correct ledger. For my entire existence, I had been trying to balance an equation that was rigged against me. I kept adding my achievements, my independence, and my silent compliance, expecting the sum to equal love. But the formula was broken. Evelyn did not fix their formula. She just gave me a new accounting system. We finished our meal in a comfortable silence. The waiter cleared our plates and offered a dessert menu. Evelyn declined the sweets but ordered 2 cups of black coffee. When the steaming cups arrived, she raised hers in a deliberate, silent toast. "Happy birthday, Brianna," she said. The greeting carried no forced cheer. It was an acknowledgement of survival. I raised my cup and tapped it against hers. The ceramic made a dull, satisfying sound. "Thank you," I replied. Evelyn took a sip of the dark roast. She set the cup down and folded her hands on the table. Now she said, her tone shifting back to the sharp corporate register. "Let us discuss how you are going to collect." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. I knew my parents' financial habits better than anyone. David operated his consulting firm on a razor-thin margin. He relied heavily on the corporate line of credit that Evergreen Holdings now owned. Linda required a constant stream of disposable income to maintain her social standing and fund Vanessa. They were bleeding cash on a monthly basis. It was only a matter of time before they needed an injection of capital. They will call a family meeting, I said, analyzing the predictive behavior. They always call a meeting when Vanessa needs a bailout. It usually happens midweek. They will summon me to the Bellevue house. They will sit me down and explain that family requires sacrifice. Then they will present a document for me to sign. Usually it is a request to co-sign a loan or cover a major expense. Evelyn nodded approvingly. She knew the pattern just as well as I did. And what will they ask for this time, she inquired. I thought about the fake heart condition and the luxury nail salon. I thought about the trajectory of Vanessa and her endless ambition to look successful without actually working. She has been talking about opening a boutique wellness franchise, I replied. She needs commercial retail space. Her credit is non-existent. My parents are tapped out. They will demand that I co-sign her commercial lease using my accounting firm's salary as the guarantor. It was the logical next step in their parasitic ecosystem. They had canceled my birthday to establish that Vanessa was in a fragile state. The fragile state required a new positive focus. The positive focus would be a business venture. The business venture required my signature. They had orchestrated the entire weekend just to soften me up for a financial extraction. Evelyn smiled. The trap is already closed, she murmured. They just have not realized they are standing inside it. When they summon you to that house, Brianna, you will not go as a daughter seeking approval. You will go as the primary creditor. You will let them make their pitch. You will let them lay out their demands, and then you will issue the findings of your audit. I looked out the window at the dark water of Puget Sound. The ferries were still running, cutting through the night. I felt a deep, steady rhythm in my chest. I knew the summons would arrive soon. I knew my phone would ring and my father would issue a mandatory command to appear in his living room. A younger version of myself would have dreaded that call. The current version of me, the chief executive of Evergreen Holdings, was looking forward to the meeting. I had a briefcase full of leverage, and I was ready to wait for their inevitable mistake. Sunday and Monday passed with zero communication from the Bellevue estate. I went to work, I drank my coffee, I audited corporate tax returns. I knew the silence was a calculated tactic. They were giving the fake hospital stay enough time to marinate so the narrative of my cruel absence could solidify into a family fact. On Tuesday afternoon, my cell phone vibrated against the mahogany grain of my desk. The screen lit up, displaying my father's name. I swiped open the message application, expecting a lengthy guilt trip. The text contained exactly 8 words. Family meeting tonight at the house, 6 p.m. mandatory. It lacked a greeting. It lacked a belated birthday wish. It lacked any mention of the waterfront restaurant reservation they abandoned. It was a direct, unemotional summons. In the Collins household, the phrase mandatory meeting possessed a very specific translation. It was a coded alarm bell indicating that Vanessa had created a deficit, and I was required to balance the equation. The structure of these gatherings never varied. My parents would sit on the living room sofa looking exhausted and severe, acting as the unified front of parental authority. Vanessa would sit in an armchair looking small and wounded, playing the role of the tragic victim. Then they would present me with the bill. I remembered a specific mandatory meeting during my senior year of high school. Vanessa had borrowed a neighbor's golf cart without permission and crashed it into a brick retaining wall. My father sat me down and explained that since I had saved $3,000 from my summer job lifeguarding at the community pool, it was my duty as a sister to hand over the funds to prevent a lawsuit. My mother sat next to him, nodding slowly, treating the extortion like a noble sacrifice. I handed over the cash. I went to my freshman year of college with an empty bank account while Vanessa went to an expensive cheerleading camp. A mandatory meeting was never an open discussion. It was an extraction event designed to drain my resources to plug her leaks. I did not type a paragraph defending myself against the upcoming demand. I did not ask for an agenda or inquire about my sister's fake heart condition. I replied with 3 words: "See you there." I hit send and closed the application. I looked at the digital clock on the bottom corner of my monitor. It was 4 in the afternoon. I shut down my computer and organized my desk. I decided to change my clothing before making the drive to the suburbs. I walked into the private restroom at my accounting firm and removed my standard gray cardigan and slacks. I opened the garment bag I had brought with me that morning specifically for this eventual confrontation. I slipped into a sharp, tailored navy blue suit featuring clean lines and a structured blazer. It was the exact garment I wore when I deposed hostile executives in corporate fraud cases. It projected authority and demanded respect. It was not the soft, forgiving clothing of an obedient daughter seeking forgiveness. It was the armor of a chief executive officer stepping into a hostile negotiation. I adjusted the cuffs and looked at my reflection in the mirror. I did not recognize the anxious girl who used to shrink under my father's gaze. The woman looking back at me was a landlord preparing to serve notice. I returned to my office and opened the bottom drawer of my desk. I reached inside and retrieved the thick manila folder Evelyn had given me on Saturday night. I did not open it to verify the contents. I already knew every line item, every mortgage term, and every distribution clause by memory. I slid the heavy paper stack into my structured leather tote bag. I zipped the compartment shut, securing the leverage safely inside. I walked out of the building and stepped into the damp Washington air, ready to execute the final phase of Evelyn's design. I merged my car onto the highway and drove toward the floating bridge connecting Seattle to the eastern suburbs. The sky above the water was an iron gray, matching the dark, heavy currents of the lake below. Rain began to fall in a slow, steady rhythm, smearing the windshield before the wipers swept it away. The traffic was dense, a sea of red taillights stretching across the concrete span. During previous trips across this bridge, my physical reaction was always identical. My heart would race, my palms would sweat against the steering wheel. I would rehearse defensive speeches in my head, preparing to justify my bank account and defend my personal boundaries. I would arrive at their driveway already exhausted from the imaginary arguments. Today, my resting heart rate remained entirely flat. My hands gripped the leather wheel with a relaxed, steady certainty. I did not practice a speech. I did not brace for emotional impact. The fear of parental disappointment only holds power when you still crave their approval. Once you realize the approval is a fraudulent commodity, the fear evaporates without a trace. I carried the calm of a woman who had already read the final page of a book the rest of the room thought they were still writing. They believed they were preparing to ambush a guilty sibling who skipped a hospital vigil. They had no idea they were summoning their primary creditor. I was not driving to an ambush. I was driving to a forensic audit, and I was the only person holding a pen. I exited the highway and navigated the winding tree-lined streets of the wealthy Bellevue neighborhood. The houses here were designed to project an image of effortless prosperity, hiding the heavy debts required to maintain the illusion. I turned onto my parents' street and pulled up to the wrought iron gates guarding their driveway. The gates swung open automatically, recognizing the transponder on my windshield. I drove up the long paved incline and parked my car next to my father's leased luxury sedan. I turned off the engine and looked at the sprawling $4 million estate through the rain-streaked glass. I used to look at the manicured lawns, the towering entry pillars, and the custom-leaded glass doors, and feel a sense of intimidating grandeur. My mother had curated every square inch of the exterior to enforce a strict social hierarchy. The house was designed to make visitors feel small and inadequate. Today, the architectural intimidation failed to register on my nervous system. I looked at the imported roof tiles and the expensive landscaping and evaluated them like a property appraiser. I did not see a childhood home filled with ghosts of neglect. I saw a tangible asset listed on Schedule A of a corporate holding trust. I saw the collateral that secured a private mortgage note. I saw my property. I unbuckled my seatbelt and picked up my leather tote bag. The weight of the folder inside felt substantial and grounding against my side. I stepped out into the cold drizzle and walked up the stone pathway toward the front entrance. I did not feel the need to ring the doorbell and wait for permission to enter the premises. I grasped the heavy brass handle and pushed the custom oak doors open. I stepped into the grand foyer, leaving the wet weather behind me. I heard the low murmur of voices coming from the sunken living room down the hall. They were waiting for me. They were ready to execute their extraction. I took a slow breath, smoothed the lapels of my navy suit, and walked down the corridor to issue my opening statement. I walked down the corridor and stepped down into the sunken living room. The space was a curated masterpiece of mid-century modern furniture and staged perfection. Every item in the room served a specific psychological purpose. The low-profile couches were designed to make the occupants feel relaxed, while the sharp angles of the glass tables conveyed a subtle underlying tension. My parents utilized interior design the same way they utilized people. They placed objects and individuals exactly where they wanted them to control the environment. Vanessa was curled on a pristine white sofa. She was clutching a ceramic mug of herbal tea with both hands. She wore an oversized cashmere sweater, and her posture was slumped, mimicking the artful defeat of a Victorian invalid. It was a practiced physical pose. During a brief stint in a high school theater program, Vanessa learned that projecting physical weakness yielded far more applause than actually remembering her lines. She carried that single lesson into adulthood, performing exhaustion whenever she needed an audience to solve her problems. David and Linda sat opposite her on matching leather armchairs. They wore identical expressions of grim determination. They looked like an executive board preparing to discipline an uncooperative employee. My father pointed a stiff index finger toward a lone accent chair positioned at the center of the room. He told me to sit down. His voice carried the same practiced authority he used when directing junior consultants at his failing firm. I did not walk over to the seat. I stepped behind the accent chair and rested my hands firmly on the top of the upholstery. In any corporate negotiation, taking a seated position lower than your opponents automatically surrenders the physical high ground. It forces you to look up, transferring visual control to the individuals dictating the space. By remaining on my feet, I disrupted the staging they had carefully prepared. I looked down at the three of them, allowing the silence to stretch across the room. My mother released a deep, suffering sigh. It was the specific exhalation of a woman dealing with a difficult subordinate who refuses to follow the script. She crossed her legs and folded her hands over her knee. Her voice dripped with an artificial sweetness that coated the underlying demand. She informed me that Vanessa had discovered an incredible opportunity to buy into a holistic wellness franchise. She framed the business venture not as a financial risk, but as a profound spiritual calling that would finally stabilize my sister. Linda paused to let the concept settle before executing the pivot. She lowered her gaze and adopted a tone of grave concern. She explained that securing the commercial retail space required a pristine financial background. Then she delivered the lie with unwavering confidence. She claimed that Vanessa suffered a severe hit to her credit score due to the sudden influx of medical bills from her hospital stay over the weekend. I stood behind the chair and processed the sheer audacity of the statement. The timeline was a factual impossibility. Medical billing codes take weeks to process through insurance providers, and credit reporting agencies do not penalize a consumer within 72 hours of a clinic visit. They were weaponizing a fake medical emergency they invented 3 days ago to explain away a decade of my sister destroying her own credit rating. They canceled my 25th birthday to establish the tragedy, and they were now attempting to cash in the receipt. The final phase of the extraction arrived right on cue. Linda looked up and met my eyes. She said they needed me to co-sign the commercial lease for the franchise location. She waved her hand through the air as if she were brushing away a minor speck of dust. She insisted it was just a simple formality. She promised that Vanessa would cover the monthly rent, and my signature was only required to satisfy the strict requirements of the property management group. Then my mother delivered the closing argument using a phrase I recognized from years of forced compliance. Blood looks after blood, she stated. I felt the steady hum of the accounting firm replace the old childhood anxiety. A commercial lease is never a simple formality. It is a legally binding anchor. If a tenant defaults on a commercial lease, the guarantor is personally liable for the remaining duration of the contract, which often spans 5 to 10 years. They were not asking me for a favor. They were demanding that I pledge my corporate salary, my credit history, and my future stability to subsidize a wellness franchise for a sibling who despised my very existence. I looked at David. He remained silent, letting Linda execute the heavy lifting. This was his standard operating procedure. He preferred to remain the silent authority figure, intervening only if the target resisted the initial pitch. David built a career advising small businesses on restructuring. He knew the devastating legal consequences of a defaulted commercial lease better than anyone in the room. He knew that the failure rate for boutique wellness franchises was astronomically high. He knew he was asking me to step onto a sinking ship and tether the anchor chain to my own neck. He knew all of this, and he sat in his leather chair waiting for me to pick up the pen. Vanessa took a slow sip from her ceramic mug. She peeked over the rim, watching my reaction. She did not possess the financial literacy to understand the ruin she was asking me to assume. She only understood that she wanted a retail space with her name on the door, and I was the designated obstacle standing in her way. She expected me to fold. She expected the guilt of my absence during her weekend crisis to force my hand. The entire room was holding its breath, waiting for the capable daughter to accept her punishment and sign away her security. The phrase "blood looks after blood" was the cornerstone of the Collins family doctrine. My parents deployed it whenever they needed to justify an unbalanced transaction. When I was 19, they used that exact phrase to convince me to surrender my reliable sedan so Vanessa could drive to her out-of-state college. They promised to help me secure a replacement vehicle, but the assistance never materialized. I spent my sophomore year riding 2 different city buses to reach my accounting classes, while Vanessa collected parking tickets on a campus 400 miles away. The phrase was never used to protect me. It was exclusively utilized as a tool for extraction. I analyzed the specific nature of the business venture, a wellness franchise. It was the perfect vanity project for someone who wanted the title of a business owner without enduring the grueling labor of actual entrepreneurship. The franchise model provides the branding, the marketing materials, and the product lines. The franchisee simply purchases the illusion of success. My mother loved the concept because it offered exceptional social currency. She could tell her country club friends that her youngest daughter was a wellness entrepreneur. They were willing to sacrifice my financial independence just to purchase a compelling talking point for their next charity gala. I stood in the quiet elegance of the sunken living room holding my leather tote bag. The manila folder rested inside, pressing against my side like a loaded weapon. They had presented their demands. They had utilized the fake illness to justify the theft. They had recited the family motto. The audit phase of the evening was officially complete. They had laid all their cards on the glass table. I looked at the 3 architects of my lifelong isolation and prepared to issue my findings. I will not be co-signing anything, I said quietly. I kept my voice low and even. I did not inject the sentence with defiance or anger. I delivered the words with the flat neutrality of a meteorologist reporting the barometric pressure. The air in the sunken living room stopped moving. The choreographed extraction hit a concrete wall. Vanessa lowered her ceramic mug. The practiced look of Victorian defeat vanished from her features. Her lower lip began to tremble. It was a physical reflex she had perfected by the age of 8. Whenever a teacher or a parent attempted to hold her responsible for a misdeed, she would deploy the trembling lip. It was an early warning system signaling an impending emotional detonation if the boundary was not retracted. She waited for me to apologize and fold under the pressure. When I remained silent, standing behind the accent chair, the tremble escalated into a full performance. "You are so selfish!" Vanessa cried out. She brought the mug down hard against the glass coffee table. The ceramic impacted the surface with a sharp crack that echoed across the vaulted ceiling. She leaned forward, gripping the edge of the sofa cushions with white knuckles. "I almost died this weekend," she yelled, her voice escalating into a shrill and piercing register. "I was lying in a hospital bed, hooked up to heart monitors, and you could not even send a single text message to check on me. All you care about is your stupid bank accounts. You have always been jealous of me, and now you are trying to ruin my life, just to punish me." When Vanessa screamed that she almost died, I pictured the social media video on my office monitor. I saw the pale pink fingernail polish and the glass of sparkling water at the luxury salon. Gaslighting is a highly specific form of psychological abuse. It requires the abuser to present a fabricated reality with such intense conviction that the victim begins to doubt their own sanity. Vanessa was a master of the craft. She demanded empathy for a fatal heart condition that never existed. She wanted me to apologize for failing to attend a vigil at a boutique day spa. She spun the narrative so rapidly, attempting to put me on trial for a crime she invented. I watched her perform. Her face flushed red, real tears pooled in the corners of her eyes. She had lied so often and so effectively that she actually believed her own script. She convinced her own nervous system that she was in danger. My mother opened her mouth to join the chorus of accusations, but my father lifted a hand to silence her. David realized the soft approach had failed. He decided to transition to hostile negotiation tactics. He stood up from his leather armchair. He was a tall man, and he frequently used his physical height to reclaim authority in rooms where he was losing control. He buttoned the center button of his suit jacket, an involuntary tell he displayed whenever he prepared to issue an ultimatum. He stepped around the coffee table, closing the physical distance between us. This was a classic boardroom intimidation tactic. I had watched him use this exact method on building contractors when he wanted to renegotiate a signed agreement. He would invade their personal space, use his height to cast a shadow, and lower his voice to a threatening rumble. He expected the opposing party to become flustered and concede the argument just to escape the physical discomfort. He tried to apply this bullying to his own daughter in his own living room. "We are not asking," Brianna, my father stated. His tone abandoned the gentle paternal facade. It was cold and transactional. He looked down at me, expecting my posture to break under his proximity. "We have invested hundreds of thousands of dollars raising you," he continued. "We put a roof over your head. We clothed you. We put you through school so you could sit in a downtown office and build those bank accounts your sister is talking about. It is time for a return on that investment. You are the strong one. Vanessa needs us." I listened to the words hang in the space between us. A return on investment. He did not ask me to help out of love. He did not appeal to a sense of shared family history. He categorized my childhood as a financial expenditure that was currently in arrears. He was calling in a debt. It was a fascinating accounting error. They did not pay for my university degree. I paid for it using academic scholarships and by working 30 hours a week at a pharmacy. They provided a roof over my head during my minor years, which is a basic legal requirement of parenthood, not a generous venture capital investment. David was inflating his initial capital contribution to justify a predatory interest rate. He wanted to claim ownership of my current stability based on falsified historical data. I kept my eyes locked on his face. I did not flinch. I let the phrase return on investment echo in my mind. It was a profound gift. For 25 years, I had tortured myself trying to decipher the complex emotional puzzle of their neglect. I spent countless nights wondering what character flaw made me unlovable to the people who brought me into the world. I analyzed my grades, my behavior, and my career choices, searching for the variable that would balance the equation. My father just handed me the answer key. There was no emotional puzzle. There was no hidden deficit in my character. I was simply an asset. When a corporation acquires a piece of heavy machinery, they do not love the machine. They maintain it just enough to keep it operational. They extract every ounce of utility it can provide, and when the machine reaches maturity and the market conditions align, they liquidate it to fund their preferred projects. My parents had maintained me. They provided the minimum required shelter to ensure I would become a high-yield asset. Now the market conditions required capital for a wellness franchise. They were ready to liquidate my credit score to fund Vanessa. The sudden clarity was staggering. The architects of my isolation stood in front of me demanding the final payout. They were the people who had convinced me that independence meant being entirely alone. They taught me to build walls around myself so they could quietly mine the territory outside those boundaries without interference. A cool, clinical detachment settled over my skin. It felt like stepping out of a humid swamp into a refrigerated vault. The childhood fear evaporated. The desperate, lingering hope for parental validation turned to dust and blew away. I looked at Vanessa sitting on the white sofa, clutching her chest and breathing in shallow, theatrical gasps. I looked at Linda, gripping the armrests of her chair, watching the confrontation with hungry anticipation. I looked at David looming over me, expecting my resolve to crumble. The audit was over. I had examined the ledgers. I had observed the behavior. I had gathered the verbal confessions directly from the source. The investigation phase of my life was officially concluded. I did not step back from my father. I held my ground behind the accent chair. I slowly reached down to my side and unzipped the top compartment of my structured leather tote bag. The heavy brass zipper teeth parted with a smooth metallic glide. I reached inside the dark interior. My fingers brushed against the smooth, heavy paper of the manila folder. I grasped the spine. I did not rush the movement. I pulled the folder out into the bright light of the living room. It was time to issue the findings. I reached down into the dark interior of my structured leather tote bag. My fingers brushed against the smooth, heavy paper of the manila folder Evelyn had given me. I grasped the spine and pulled the document out into the bright recessed lighting of the sunken living room. I did not throw the folder. I did not toss it to create a dramatic theatrical effect. I moved with slow, deliberate precision. I set the paper gently onto the surface of the glass coffee table, placing it exactly 1 inch away from the ceramic mug Vanessa was clutching. The heavy paper made a soft, muffled sound against the thick glass. Before we discuss returns on investment, I said, keeping my voice in the same neutral register I used for corporate depositions, I have a question about the financing on this house. My father stopped speaking in the middle of his lecture. The forward physical momentum he had generated by looming over me simply died in his chest. He blinked twice, his brow furrowed, forming deep vertical lines above the bridge of his nose. The sudden shift in topic threw his mental processing out of alignment. He was prepared to argue about sibling loyalty and financial obligations. He was entirely unprepared for a forensic inquiry into his own liabilities. He looked at the plain manila folder and then he looked back up at my face. "Excuse me," he asked. His voice lost the booming authoritative rumble. It sounded thin and genuinely confused. "The house," I repeated, keeping my tone perfectly level. "And your corporate line of credit. You refinanced both 5 years ago through a private Delaware firm, correct?" The great irony of the consulting industry is that the men who sell strategy are often the ones who refuse to apply it to their own ledgers. David operated a boutique firm advising mid-level executives on restructuring their operations. Yet when his own client list began to evaporate, he failed to adapt. He refused to downsize his office space or reduce his overhead. He believed that projecting an image of extreme wealth was the only way to attract new wealth. He treated optics as a substitute for revenue. 5 years ago, his firm was running out of capital. To maintain his country club memberships and keep the imported vehicles in the driveway, he leveraged the only tangible asset he possessed. He refinanced this sprawling Bellevue estate, extracting every available dollar of equity. Traditional banks viewed his debt-to-income ratio as a severe liability. They denied his applications. He was forced to seek capital from a private equity lender operating out of Delaware. Delaware is a designated haven for anonymous corporate entities. Wealthy investors build shell companies there to shield their identities and protect their assets from public scrutiny. When a debtor signs a loan with a Delaware proxy, They never know who actually holds the paper. They just send their monthly interest payments to a generic processing center and assume a faceless financial institution is cashing the checks. David signed an interest-only loan, assuming he had outsmarted the system. He bought himself 5 years of runway, believing he could outrun the principal debt. My mother looked from my face to the plain folder resting on her pristine coffee table. A sudden primal unease bled into her posture. She released her grip on the armrests and sat back against the leather cushions. Linda possessed the survival instincts of a cornered animal. She did not understand the complex mechanics of commercial refinancing, but she understood the tone of my voice. She recognized that I was not speaking like a defensive child cornered by her parents. I was speaking like an auditor who had just uncovered a hidden offshore account. The atmosphere in the room shifted and she felt the temperature drop. "What are you talking about, Brianna?" she demanded. Her pitch was too high. The artificial sweetness she used moments ago to sell the wellness franchise was entirely gone. "This is none of your business." I looked at Linda. I did not frown. I smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was the precise, professional smile of a predator that has just locked the cage. In the wild, apex predators do not roar when the prey walks into the snare. They do not need to make noise to assert their dominance. They simply sit perfectly still and wait for the prey to test the boundaries of the trap. They wait for the realization to set in that the bars are solid and the exits are sealed. I had spent my entire childhood functioning as the prey. I was the reliable resource they hunted and consumed whenever Vanessa created a deficit. Tonight, the roles were permanently reversed. "Actually, Mom," I said, letting the silence stretch for a fraction of a second before delivering the correction. As of Saturday, my 25th birthday, it became exclusively my business. I reached out and placed my index finger on the edge of the manila folder. I nudged it exactly 1 inch across the glass, directly toward my father. "Open it," I instructed. "Read the caption on the first page. Debt is an invisible predator. It lives in the walls of a luxury home. It hides beneath the imported Italian tile and the vaulted ceilings. People who live on credit exist in a constant state of low-grade panic. They buy expensive things to prove to themselves that the predator is not actually hunting them. They throw lavish charity galas and lease luxury cars to build a fortress of optics. But the ledger never forgets. The numbers wait patiently in the dark, gathering interest until the math demands a reckoning. David was a man being hunted by his own ledger, and the predator had just arrived in his living room. Vanessa sat on the white sofa, completely lost. She looked at the folder and then at our parents. The terminology of corporate finance was outside her vocabulary of victimhood. She did not understand the implications of a private Delaware firm or an interest-only commercial loan. She only knew that the attention had suddenly shifted away from her holistic wellness franchise, and she despised the loss of the spotlight. She opened her mouth to complain that we were getting off topic, but the suffocating tension in the room caused the words to die in her throat. Nobody was looking at her. The entire gravitational pull of the estate was centered on the plain paper resting on the glass table. David stared at the folder like it was a live, explosive device. For a man who built his entire identity around financial prowess and intellectual superiority, being audited by his own scapegoat daughter was a cognitive short-circuit. He did not want to touch the paper. He knew that acknowledging the document would alter the fabric of his reality. As long as the folder remained closed, he could still pretend he was the king of his castle. He could still pretend he held authority over the woman standing behind the accent chair. When you hold absolute leverage, you never have to raise your voice. Power is quiet. It sits perfectly still while the people who lack it expend all their energy trying to maintain an illusion. My parents had spent decades building an elaborate stage set. They assigned me the role of the silent supporting actor meant to prop up the scenery while Vanessa danced in the center light. The folder on the table was the match that would burn the theater to the ground. The silence stretched until it became physically uncomfortable. The rain beat against the large picture windows overlooking the dark Bellevue streets. The soft ambient lighting of the staged living room felt suddenly harsh and clinical. David realized he could not ignore the paper. Refusing to look at it would be an admission of fear. He needed to prove he was still in control of the negotiation. He took a slow breath and adjusted the cuffs of his tailored shirt. He slowly reached out his hand toward the center of the glass table. His knuckles were pale. The arrogant executive who had tried to intimidate me 3 minutes ago was gone. He picked up the manila folder and folded back the cover to read the bold, legal header printed on the first page. David snatched the manila folder from the surface of the glass table. His movements lacked the calculated grace he usually employed during client presentations. His face flushed a deep, uneven red, betraying his irritation at the sudden shift in the conversation. He flipped the heavy paper cover back to expose the first page. I watched his eyes track across the page. I observed the exact moment his gaze registered the bold legal header printed at the top of the document. Evergreen Holdings, LLC. He knew that name intimately. Every 30th day of the month for the past 5 years, he sat at his mahogany desk and authorized an electronic funds transfer to a holding account bearing that exact title. He believed he was sending his money to a vast, unfeeling corporate entity operating out of a generic office building in Delaware. He never imagined the chief executive of that entity was standing in his own living room wearing a navy suit. His early career was built on meticulous attention to detail. David started as a junior analyst, hungry and precise. He earned his promotions by finding the structural weaknesses in other companies. But somewhere along the line he stopped applying that scrutiny to his own life. He traded equity for appearance. He leased the luxury cars and bought the imported watches to project success while quietly hemorrhaging capital. His arrogance blinded him to the possibility that someone else might be auditing his decisions. His eyes continued down the page, scanning the asset acquisition clauses. He hit Schedule A. He read the parcel number of the Bellevue estate where he was currently sitting. He read the commercial loan identification number attached to his struggling consulting firm. He saw the interest rates and the principal balances listed with flawless accounting precision. The math was stark and undeniable. The physical transformation occurred in a matter of seconds. The angry red flush drained out of his cheeks, leaving his skin the color of wet ash. The confident posture of the successful executive collapsed inward. His shoulders slumped, and his hands began to tremble, causing the edges of the thick paper to vibrate. "This is a forgery," he stammered. His voice lacked any trace of conviction. It sounded hollow and desperate. When an auditor presents irrefutable evidence of financial misconduct, the target always follows a predictable sequence of grief. The first stage is always denial. They accuse the investigator of manipulating the data. They claim the signatures are fake. They cling to the illusion because acknowledging the truth requires them to face the consequences of their actions. David knew the document was real. He recognized the specific loan origination dates and the exact fractional interest rates. He just needed to hear himself deny it out loud to delay the inevitable. "Grandma Evelyn transferred the holding company to me on Saturday," I stated clearly. I let the words travel across the space between us, bouncing off the vaulted ceilings and settling into the expensive fabric of the sofas. I did not raise my pitch. I did not sound triumphant or vindictive. I delivered the information with the detached certainty of a judge reading a final verdict into the public record. I explained that the company owning the paper on his business and the company holding the deed to the house he was sitting in were no longer abstract concepts. I told him he did not owe a bank in Delaware. I looked directly into his eyes and told him he owed me. The geometry of the room fundamentally shifted. The power dynamic that had defined my entire existence inverted in the space of a single breath. The father who had commanded my obedience through financial intimidation was now holding a document that proved his entire life belonged to me. The daughter he had treated as a disposable utility was now the sole proprietor of his security. Vanessa shifted on the white sofa. She was entirely incapable of reading the room. She lacked the financial vocabulary to comprehend the magnitude of the paperwork resting in our father's hands. She only understood that the focus of the meeting had drifted away from her holistic wellness franchise. She felt the spotlight fading and she panicked. She lived her entire life insulated from consequence, believing that money simply appeared whenever she required it. "What does that mean?" she whined, slamming her ceramic mug down again. "Make her sign my lease." Her voice sounded remarkably childish, cutting through the heavy silence. She looked at David, expecting him to issue a harsh command, and force me to comply with her demands. She expected the old machinery to function just as it always had. She expected the capable sister to absorb the damage so the fragile sister could thrive. She thought a commercial lease was just a piece of paper that adults signed to make things happen. She had no concept of the liability involved. David did not look at her. He could not look at her. He was trapped inside the realization that he possessed zero leverage to enforce any demands. Linda leaned forward from her leather armchair. The primal unease she exhibited earlier escalated into a frantic kinetic energy. She reached out and grabbed the edge of the folder, pulling it toward her so she could read the text over David's trembling shoulder. Linda was not a financial strategist, but she possessed a ruthless instinct for survival. Her entire identity was anchored to the physical boundaries of the Bellevue estate. The chef kitchen, the infinity pool, the imported tiles were not just architectural features. They were the armor she wore to navigate her social circles. She hosted charity galas in this room specifically to mask the empty accounts and secure her standing among the local elite. The house was her only true achievement. She read the distribution schedule at the bottom of the page. She read the clause dictating the transfer of full controlling interest upon my 25th birthday. The realization hit her like a physical blow. I watched her breath hitch in her throat. The polished facade of the Seattle matriarch shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. She looked up from the paper and stared at me. She was looking at the daughter she had starved of affection for 2 decades. She was looking at the child she had deliberately isolated and reduced to a silent problem solver. She realized that the person she had treated with such profound disregard was now her landlord. The girl she canceled a birthday dinner on was now her primary creditor. The capable one was now her absolute ruin. I watched the panic bloom in Linda's eyes. When you build your life on a foundation of lies and borrowed money, you live in constant fear of the architect who holds the blueprints. Linda knew that I possessed an intimate understanding of her cruelty. She knew I had cataloged every missed graduation, every canceled dinner, and every manufactured crisis. She knew that if I decided to call in the debts, she would lose everything that made her feel superior. She would be forced to face the country club elite as an evicted tenant rather than a wealthy host. The irony of the situation was a heavy, suffocating blanket over the living room. They had summoned me to this house to orchestrate a theft. They intended to manipulate my sense of familial obligation to steal my credit score for Vanessa. Instead, they walked blindly into an audit that stripped them of their own assets. They thought they were the predators circling a wounded animal. They did not realize they had wandered into an enclosure and the gate had just locked behind them. I stood behind the accent chair, resting my hands on the upholstery. I did not move to comfort them. I did not offer a gentle reassurance that I would grant them an extension on their loans. I simply let them sit in the wreckage of their own arrogance. The silence stretched out long and deep, filled only by the sound of the rain hitting the large windows. The old Brianna would have felt a surge of guilt watching her parents crumble. The new Brianna felt only the clean, satisfying logic of a perfectly balanced ledger. The truth was finally sitting on the table, and there was no amount of gaslighting that could make it disappear. The polished Bellevue matriarch facade shattered right in front of my eyes. Linda lunged forward across the heavy glass coffee table. Her manicured hands grabbed the empty air as if she wanted to physically rip the manila folder away from my father. Her voice rose to a shrill, unrecognizable pitch. She did not sound like the sophisticated woman who hosted elegant charity galas and served on the boards of local museums. She sounded feral. She screamed that I stole this wealth from the family. She yelled that I manipulated a sick old woman into signing away an entire estate. She pointed a shaking finger directly at my face and declared that they were my parents and I owed them everything I had. Her composure completely abandoned her. She began to pace a tight, frantic circle on the imported Persian rug, projecting her rage into the vaulted ceiling. She threatened to tie the holding company up in probate court for decades. She promised to hire the most ruthless attorneys in Washington to destroy me with endless litigation until I begged her to settle. I did not flinch. I did not step back or raise my hands in a defensive posture. I stood firmly behind the accent chair and let her yell. I let the sheer volume of her guilt fill the entire sunken living room, drowning out the sound of the rain hitting the glass. When you spend your career sitting in corporate boardrooms, mediating hostile financial disputes, you learn a universal truth about human behavior. The person shouting is always the person who has lost the argument. Volume is the last desperate refuge of the powerless. Linda had a long and well-documented history of using legal threats to enforce her will upon the world. When I was in high school, she threatened to sue our neighborhood homeowner association over the specific shade of paint they approved for a nearby property line fence. She threatened to bankrupt a local landscaping company because they pruned her decorative rose bushes at the wrong angle. She treated the legal system like a magic wand she could wave to make working-class people submit to her demands. She assumed I would react the exact same way the terrified landscapers did. She thought the mere mention of aggressive lawyers would force me to surrender the holding company and apologize for my insolence. She finished her tirade breathing heavily with her chest heaving under her expensive silk blouse. She stared at me waiting for the apology to spill from my lips. She waited for me to crumble under the heavy weight of her maternal fury. I looked at her and spoke with a smooth, effortless cadence. I told her to go ahead and contest it. I explained that my corporate attorneys were already on retainer. I informed her that Evelyn utilized a premier estate law firm in downtown Seattle to draft the corporate bylaws and oversee the asset transfer. I invited her to file a legal injunction and spend her dwindling cash reserves fighting an airtight, legally binding document. But I also issued a firm guarantee. I told her that the moment her lawyer filed the very first piece of hostile paperwork, I would call in the commercial loan attached to Collins Strategic Consulting. The terms of an interest-only commercial note are notoriously rigid and unforgiving. The creditor holds the absolute right to demand immediate repayment of the principal balance if the debtor experiences a material change in financial circumstance or initiates hostile legal action against the holding entity. I outlined this grim reality for my mother using precise clinical financial terminology. I told her that while we litigate the trust over the next several months, I will immediately trigger the default clause on my father. He would have exactly 30 days to produce the full principal balance in cash. When he inevitably failed to secure those massive funds, the default would bankrupt his consulting firm entirely. He would lose his leased office space, his remaining clients, and his primary source of income before the court even scheduled our first preliminary hearing. The silence that followed my statement was absolute. The ambient noise of the storm outside seemed to magnify in the void. Vanessa sat frozen on the white sofa. For the first time in her entire adult life, she finally understood the math of her own existence. The performance of the tragic victim requires an audience with deep pockets to be effective. As she listened to me describe the brutal mechanics of corporate bankruptcy, the thick fog of her delusion burned away. Her fake tears dried up instantly. The trembling lower lip steadied into a straight, tight line of sheer, unadulterated panic. Vanessa never learned how to survive on her own. She never paid her own rent with money she earned. She never filed a tax return without David sitting beside her and holding her hand. Her entire identity relied on the core assumption that the bank of mom and dad would remain solvent forever. She looked at Linda standing frozen on the rug, and then she looked at David holding the open manila folder. She saw the undeniable truth written in their terrified, defeated postures. The automated teller machine was officially closed. There would be no holistic wellness franchise to play with. There would be no more emergency bailouts to cover her luxury apartment lease. The safety net she had taken for granted her entire life was currently standing across the room holding the scissors. My father did not attempt to join the argument or defend his wife. He did not puff out his chest or try to reclaim his lost authority. He simply sank backward onto the plush leather sofa. The paperwork slipped from his trembling fingers and landed softly on the cushions beside his leg. He raised both hands and buried his face in his palms, rubbing his eyes as if he were trying to wake up from a terrifying nightmare. David understood the legal reality far better than his wife or his youngest daughter ever could. He knew the specific tier of attorneys Evelyn employed. He knew those firms did not draft vulnerable or ambiguous contracts. He knew the paperwork was ironclad and completely impenetrable. He realized with crushing clarity that his mother had watched his financial recklessness for years and methodically built an inescapable cage around him. Evelyn had outplayed him on every conceivable level. The tragedy of David Collins was fundamentally a tragedy of poor investments. He built his entire consulting career advising companies on risk management, but he completely failed to manage the risk inside his own home. He looked at his two daughters years ago and made a calculated choice. He chose to invest all his capital, his energy, and his loyalty into the fragile daughter. He enabled her weakness because her constant need for rescue made him feel powerful and necessary. He simultaneously ignored and alienated the strong daughter, assuming her capability required zero maintenance or affection. He sat on the sofa with his face hidden, realizing the catastrophic failure of his long-term strategy. He had watered a weed for 25 years, while systematically starving a tree. Now the storm had finally arrived. The weed was offering absolutely no shelter from the wind, and the tree had grown tall enough to block out the sun. He had chosen the fragile daughter, and the strong one had just inherited the earth. Vanessa shifted her weight on the sofa, pulling a decorative throw pillow tight against her chest. She wielded the embroidered fabric like a physical shield against the harsh reality settling over the room. "You are a monster," she spat. The words lacked her usual theatrical polish. They sounded raw and untethered. I looked at her huddled on the cushions. For her entire life, she had cast herself as the fragile protagonist in a hostile world. Every protagonist requires a villain to justify their weakness. She was assigning me that role right now because acknowledging her own parasitic behavior would shatter her identity. She needed to believe I was executing a cruel, unprovoked attack. If she admitted the truth, she would have to accept that her fake hospital visit and her endless demands were the exact catalysts that triggered the collapse of her comfortable existence. I did not reject the label. I looked at Vanessa hiding behind her velvet pillow, and then I shifted my gaze to my parents who were drowning in the rising tide of their own hubris. "No," I said, my voice remaining soft and even. "I am just an accountant. I ran the numbers. You only kept me around for the benefits. Now the benefits have expired. For 2 decades, my presence in this family was a calculated subsidy. I provided the emotional buffer, the financial backstop, and the reliable baseline they needed to sustain their favorite child. I was the silent partner funding their dysfunction. I accepted the terms of that bad deal because I thought it was the only contract available to me. Evelyn showed me a different market. She taught me the profound strength of the let them philosophy. The concept is incredibly simple. You stop trying to force people to value you. You stop arguing. You stop pleading for a seat at their table. You simply let them make their choices, and then you let them survive the outcome without your intervention. I reached my right hand into the interior pocket of my navy suit blazer. My fingers located the thick, rigid edges of a sealed legal envelope. I pulled the document free and held it suspended over the glass coffee table for a brief moment. I let it drop. The heavy paper landed directly on top of the open manila folder covering the bold header of Evergreen Holdings. "That is a formal notice of restructuring," I explained, letting the legal terminology dictate the temperature of the room. "You have exactly 90 days to find new financing and buy me out of this residential property. If you cannot secure the capital within that time frame, I will put this house on the market." 90 days is a standard window in commercial lending, but it is a death sentence for a debtor with a failing business. David knew the math operating behind my deadline. He knew traditional banks require pristine credit histories, verifiable income streams, and substantial liquid reserves to underwrite a multi-million-dollar estate. He possessed none of those assets. He could not refinance the property because his debt-to-income ratio was toxic. He could not leverage his consulting firm because I owned that paper too. He would spend the next 3 months making desperate phone calls to loan officers who would look at his ledgers and politely decline his applications. The notice of restructuring was essentially an eviction notice printed on high-quality bond paper. In 3 months, the custom chef kitchen, the infinity pool overlooking the city, and the vaulted ceilings would be listed on a regional real estate database. Strangers would walk through these staged rooms, judging the fixtures and measuring the walls. The fortress of optics my parents built to intimidate their neighbors was going up for sale. Linda comprehended the finality of the envelope. The polished armor she wore for her charity events and country club luncheons dissolved right in front of me. She let out a choked, ragged sob that caught deep in her throat. The sound was unfamiliar. It was not the theatrical sigh of a put-upon matriarch dealing with a minor inconvenience. It was the genuine sound of a woman realizing her entire social identity was about to be liquidated to the highest bidder. Her standing in the Bellevue elite required an address she could no longer afford to keep. She reached her right hand toward me across the empty space separating the armchair and the accent chair. Her fingers trembled visibly. I noticed the heavy diamond ring catching the recessed lighting. It was the same hand that had waved away my academic achievements. It was the same hand that had prioritized scheduling spa treatments over attending my college graduation. Now it was extended in a desperate plea for mercy. "Brianna, please," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of her impending ruin. "We are family." I looked down at her outstretched hand. I waited for the biological response. I waited for the ingrained childhood programming to activate and force me to comfort her. I expected a final flicker of guilt or a sudden surge of vindictive joy. I searched my nervous system for anger. I scanned my chest for the deep, familiar ache of grief. I found nothing. There was no lingering resentment. There was no sadness. There was only a clean, vast expanse of empty space, occupying the exact location where an obligation used to live. The neurological pathways that connected my self-worth to their approval were permanently severed. You cannot hate someone whose opinion holds zero value. The anger requires a baseline level of hope. It requires the belief that the other person might eventually change their behavior if they finally understand your pain. Once you accept that they will never change, the anger evaporates. It leaves behind a cool clinical detachment. "Family is whoever shows up," I said, breaking the silence with a simple, indisputable fact. You did not. They prioritized a fake medical emergency over my milestone birthday. I let them. They chose to skip the dinner at the waterfront restaurant to coddle my sister. I let them. They wanted to operate a family like a transaction, extracting value from the capable daughter to fund the fragile one. I let them. I simply closed the account when the balance dipped below zero. I did not wait for Linda to retract her hand. I did not wait for David to lift his face from his palms, or for Vanessa to invent a new medical symptom to reclaim the narrative. The audit was complete. The findings were issued. The collection process was officially underway. There was nothing left to discuss in the sunken living room. I picked up my structured leather tote bag and shifted the strap over my shoulder. I turned my back on the coffee table, the legal documents, and the 3 architects of my childhood isolation. I did not issue a dramatic farewell statement. I walked across the imported Persian rug, feeling the solid floor beneath my sensible shoes. I moved down the wide corridor, tracing the same path I had walked 1,000 times as an anxious child, hoping for a scrap of recognition. I reached the grand foyer. The air in the entryway felt heavy and stagnant, carrying the faint, cloying scent of my mother's expensive floral arrangements. The house felt like a museum dedicated to a family that never actually existed. I grasped the cold brass handles of the custom oak double doors. I pushed them outward, breaking the artificial seal of the estate. The damp Washington air rushed inside, hitting my face with a sharp, honest chill. It smelled of rain and wet cedar and dark water. I stepped over the threshold and walked out onto the stone pathway. The electronic iron gates down the driveway stood open, waiting for my departure. I walked toward my parked car, listening to the sound of my own footsteps echoing against the wet pavement. I did not pause. I did not hesitate. I walked out into the night and I never looked back. The 90-day window expired on a rainy Tuesday morning. I did not send a reminder email. I did not call my parents to check on their progress. I simply watched the calendar on my office wall and let the legal timeline dictate the final outcome. My father spent those 3 months attempting to secure alternative capital to save his estate. He leveraged every remaining contact in his professional network. He sat in the polished lobbies of commercial banks presenting his restructuring plans to loan officers half his age. The math refused to bend to his will. His debt-to-income ratio was a toxic asset, and his consulting firm was hemorrhaging revenue. When the clock officially ran out, he defaulted on the commercial note. The corporate entity I controlled absorbed the remaining value of his business. He was forced to surrender his leased downtown office space, his imported vehicles, and the long-standing illusion of his financial expertise. The firm dissolved quietly into the Seattle rain, leaving behind nothing but empty filing cabinets and unreturned phone calls. Without his corporate income, the Bellevue estate became an unsustainable liability. They could not execute a buyout of my position. I authorized the listing the following morning. The property hit the regional real estate database on a Thursday afternoon. By Monday morning, a software executive migrating from California made an all-cash offer. He did not care about the custom imported tiles or the carefully curated aesthetic my mother had built to intimidate her neighbors. He just wanted the large square footage and the unobstructed view of the city skyline. I signed the transfer documents from my desk at the accounting firm. The transaction was clean and efficient. I sold the fortress of optics my parents used to define their worth to a stranger who planned to gut the kitchen and paint over the walls. The physical relocation was the final fracture in their elaborate illusion. They could no longer afford the prestige of the eastern suburbs. They packed their staged mid-century modern furniture into rented moving trucks and drove 30 miles south. They downsized to a modest 3-bedroom condominium in Tacoma. The building featured vinyl siding, a shared parking garage, and a strict homeowner association that monitored the noise levels. It was a perfectly functional place to live, but for Linda Collins, it represented a social death sentence. She could no longer host lavish charity galas in a sunken living room. She could no longer invite the country club elite over for catered luncheons. Without her visible wealth, she lost her audience. Without an audience, her carefully constructed identity simply ceased to exist. She spent her days organizing her reduced closet and complaining about the sound of traffic from the nearby highway. Vanessa experienced the most severe reality check of the three. The automated teller machine she had relied on her entire life was permanently out of service. She could not invent a new medical crisis to pay the rent on her luxury apartment. When the eviction notices started arriving, she tried one final desperate maneuver. She appeared in the lobby of my downtown accounting firm, wearing her designer clothes and carrying a rehearsed expression of tragic despair. She demanded to see me immediately. She told the front receptionist she was experiencing a severe panic attack and needed her sister to guide her through the emergency. I did not ride the elevator down to meet her in the lobby. I did not offer her a glass of water or a comfortable chair. I instructed the building's security desk to inform her that I was engaged in a closed client meeting and she would need to make a formal appointment to speak with me. I watched the security feed on my computer monitor. She stood by the marble pillars, waiting for a rescue that was never going to arrive. When the security guard politely asked her to clear the waiting area, the panic attack vanished. She adjusted her designer handbag, turned around, and walked out the glass doors into the busy street. The following month, Vanessa obtained her first actual job. She did not open a holistic wellness franchise. She did not become a spiritual entrepreneur. She accepted a position working the front reception desk at a suburban dental clinic. Her days of botanical facials and deep tissue massages were replaced by filing patient insurance claims and answering a multi-line phone system. She had to adhere to a strict schedule. She had to wear a uniform scrub top. She had to report to an office manager who did not care about her childhood traumas or her frequent headaches. She had to earn the money required to survive the exact same way the rest of the world did. I did not monitor their struggles with any sense of joy. I did not celebrate their ruin or invite my colleagues out for drinks, to toast their downfall. I did not drive down to Tacoma to gloat over their modest condominium, or visit the dental clinic to watch Vanessa answer the phones. Vindication is an exhausting emotion to maintain over a long period. It requires you to keep your attention focused backward on the people who hurt you. I chose to redirect my attention entirely forward. I simply did not participate in their ecosystem anymore. The ledger was balanced, the debts were collected, and the account was permanently closed. I transitioned my energy into managing Evergreen Holdings. I treated the entity with the respect and precision it required. I utilized my background in forensic accounting to identify undervalued commercial properties located in the emerging tech corridors outside the city limits. I acquired new assets, stabilized their cash flows, and multiplied the portfolio. I ensured that Grandma Evelyn lived in a state of uncompromised luxury and security. I updated her estate plans and hired a private staff to manage her waterfront property on Mercer Island. She spent her days walking her gardens and reading financial journals in her sunroom, knowing her legacy was protected by an architect who understood the true value of her labor. The seasons turned, bringing the cold rain of winter and the eventual clearing skies of spring. A full year passed since the cancellation text message that ended my family obligations. The calendar circled back to my birth month. I was turning 26. I did not receive a summons to a mandatory family meeting. I did not receive a vague excuse about a physical therapy appointment or a fake medical emergency. The silence from Tacoma remained unbroken, and I welcomed the quiet space it left behind. I decided to dictate the terms of my own celebration without waiting for anyone else to set the stage. I did not book a private corner table for 2 people. I called the exact same upscale restaurant on Puget Sound, and I reserved the primary dining room overlooking the water. Saturday night arrived clear and sharp. The dark water outside the floor-to-ceiling windows reflected the bright lights of the passing ferries. The room was not empty, and the air was not tense. The long table was full. I looked down the length of the white linen and saw a circle of people who valued my presence without an invoice attached to our interactions. There were senior partners from my firm who respected my intellect and trusted my audits. There were friends I had made during my university years who knew the quiet, reliable version of me. There were people who asked about my day and actually waited to hear the truthful answer. Evelyn sat at the head of the table wearing a pristine silver blazer. She held a dry martini in her right hand, her posture as rigid and commanding as ever. She did not need to offer a lengthy speech or a grand declaration to the room. She just looked at me down the length of the table and offered a slow, deliberate nod. We both knew the rough terrain we had navigated to reach this specific room. We both knew the high cost of the meal and the immeasurable value of the company sitting around us. The waiter approached the table carrying a large tiered chocolate cake. The dark icing was ablaze with 26 burning candles. The warm yellow light cast moving shadows against the glass windows, pushing back the darkness of the sound. In the past, a birthday candle represented a specific type of childhood anxiety. It was a stark reminder of the things I lacked and the affection I could not earn no matter how hard I worked. I used to close my eyes tight and wish for a sudden escape. I used to wish for a magical shift in my parents' behavior or a sudden validation of my worth. I looked at the flames dancing above the cake. I did not need to close my eyes. I did not need to wish for an escape route because I had already built one with my own 2 hands. I had audited the fraudulent ledgers of my childhood and drafted a new set of binding bylaws for my future. I knew exactly what my time and my energy were worth. I leaned forward and blew out the candles. The small flames extinguished in perfect unison, sending a dozen thin ribbons of gray smoke rising toward the ceiling. The applause from my friends filled the room, a genuine, honest sound that required no theatrical performance to earn. I sat back in my chair and smiled. The smoke faded into the air, leaving behind a clean, unobstructed view of the people who chose to show up. I was Brianna Collins. I was 26 years old. I knew the exact value of my life, and I knew with unwavering certainty that I would never let anyone read me the wrong number again. I often look back at the architecture of my past, not with bitterness, but with the profound clarity of a completed audit. The sprawling Bellevue estate is just a distant memory now. It is a finalized line item cleared from my personal ledger forever. My parents and my sister are closed accounts. Sometimes people ask me if I ever feel guilty for walking away from the people who raised me. They wonder if the silence in my life ever gets heavy during the holidays or on special occasions. I tell them that silence is only heavy when you are sitting in a room waiting for an apology that is never going to arrive. When you finally stop waiting, the silence transforms into the most peaceful sound in the world. I built a modern life that requires no emotional subsidies and no financial compromises. My grandmother Evelyn taught me how to read the complex numbers of corporate finance, but more importantly, she taught me how to read the true intentions of the people around me. Looking at the wreckage of my childhood and the careful rebuilding of my adult life, I can identify 5 distinct lessons that emerged from the final ledger. Lesson 1. Independence is not a currency you can use to purchase love. I spent 25 years trying to be so frictionless and capable that my parents would finally value my presence. Toxic family systems do not reward capability with affection or respect. They reward it with heavier burdens. You can never buy a seat at a table that was specifically built to exclude you. Lesson 2. A manufactured crisis is nothing more than a tool for extraction. When someone consistently creates emergencies exactly when you are supposed to be celebrated, it is never a random coincidence. It is a calculated strategy designed to keep the spotlight firmly fixed on their own selfish needs. The most effective countermeasure is not a loud argument or a presentation of evidence, it is quiet detachment. Lesson 3. You are allowed to audit the relationships in your life. We are conditioned to believe that blood ties are an unbreakable contract requiring endless personal sacrifice. That is a fraudulent concept designed to trap you. If a relationship consistently operates at a severe deficit, draining your energy, your finances, and your fundamental self-worth, you hold the right to close the account forever. True family is defined by consistent mutual investment, not by simple biological coincidence. Lesson 4. Real power is quiet. The person screaming and throwing a tantrum in a room is always the person who has already lost the negotiation. When you hold actual leverage, you do not need to raise your voice or make dramatic threats to prove your point. You simply present the cold reality of the situation and let the natural consequences do all the heavy lifting. The truth does not require a megaphone to be heard. Lesson 5. The let them philosophy is the ultimate protective boundary. You cannot control how other people choose to behave, but you can dictate your own level of participation. Let them make their selfish choices. Let them prioritize their fragile illusions. Let them face the financial and emotional ruin of their own blind arrogance. Your only job is to walk out the door and build a reality where their choices no longer affect your inner peace. I am Brianna Collins, and my books are finally balanced. I no longer fund the comfort of people who price my existence at zero. I found my true worth, and I locked it away in a vault where no one can ever touch it. Thank you for listening to my journey today. If you found value in this quiet audit of family and boundaries, please share this narrative with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below with the specific lesson that resonated with your own life the most. Do not forget to subscribe to Senior Echo Stories for more true-to-life accounts of ordinary people taking back their power and closing the gate on toxicity. I will see you in the next one.